Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Isaac Bleeman. I'm a member of the Berkeley faculty in linguistics and Jewish studies. I work mostly on Yiddish, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event and introduce our speakers. The Center for Jewish Studies is pleased to host a conversation between Keren Mock and Professor Robert Alter of UC Berkeley, focused on Dr. Mock's recent book, Hebrew, From Sacred Language to Mother Tongue, published by Columbia University Press just a few months ago, and translated from the French edition published in 2016. The book examines the modern revernacularization of Hebrew, tracing the cultural, historical, and even psychological implications of that transformation. Keren Mock is currently in the Bay Area as a visiting lecturer and Arcadia Foundation Jewish Studies teaching fellow at Stanford. She earned her PhD at Paris Diderot University, pardon my American English pronunciation, and also teaches at Sciences Po Paris. She's an associate researcher at the Institute of Texts and Modern Manuscripts and maintains a practice as a clinical psychologist. Her work brings together psychoanalysis, Jewish thought, comparative literature, and philosophy. She'll be joined in conversation by Professor Robert Alter, who probably needs no introduction here. He's Professor Emeritus of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at UC Berkeley, and his work on the literary dimensions of the Bible, biblical translation, and modern Hebrew literature has been transformational across several fields. After the conversation, we'll have plenty of time for questions from the audience. So please join me in welcoming Keren Mock and Robert Alter.
Is this working? Yeah. Well, you've gotten Keren Mock's general profile, and with the remarkable combination that I was not fully aware of until I read her CV of psychoanalysis and literature. I would just like to say a few words about her book. I encountered her book when Columbia University Press had asked me to read it, that is the French edition, and to recommend or not recommend it for translation into English. I was extremely impressed by the book. I told that to Columbia University Press, and I'm very happy they followed suit, and here we have it. Keren really gives me a certain modicum of hope for the future of the humanities, because at this dire time, when the humanities is so beleaguered, there are still younger scholars who are doing fascinating and important things. And what impressed me about the book was that it was both based on the most thorough, rigorous scholarship, looking into corners, I would say, that previous scholars never had. And it was quite original. Original to begin with in its structure. Can I say something
Sure.
about that? Yeah. So it works backwards chronologically. There are 3/3. The first third is devoted to 3 Israeli novelists whose first language was not Hebrew. One of them, Sami, actually began to publish in Arabic before having moved to Israel, not quite of his own choice. He was very left in his politics and would not have, had Iraq not become so hostile to him, he probably would have liked to stay there. So the first third of the book is on these 3 novelists. The second third goes back to Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, whose name you see circled on the screen above, who is often spoken of as the father of modern Hebrew. That is, he was a lexicographer. He composed the first serious dictionary of Hebrew. He was also fanatic about speaking Hebrew. His son Itamar was allowed to speak only Hebrew, and his father touted him as the first normal speaker of modern Hebrew. The third section of the novel, and the one that I think is most surprising, is on Spinoza. Spinoza, unbeknownst to many of us, including me, wrote a grammar of Hebrew. And Keren shows by inspecting the grammar that what he did with the Hebrew language was, I don't know if you made this comparison, but rather analogous to what he did with the Bible. That is, turning the Bible into a text that we looked at historically like any other text. And what he did in his grammar was to treat Hebrew the way you would treat French or German or Italian. So the story of the normalization of Hebrew goes back that far. And I was grateful to read this book, and I hope many of you will be encouraged to read it as well. I'll now turn things over to Keren.
So, first of all, I would like to thank the Berkeley Center for Jewish Studies and Etta Heber for inviting me, and Jennifer Lipscomb. And thank you so much, Robert Alter, for supporting my book and for the inspiring introduction and you gave on the book. So this book came from a question. How did Hebrew become a new mother tongue? What is a new mother tongue, actually? And when working on the book, I saw that, of course, there is linguistic research on Hebrew, considered mainly as a Semitic language. But I thought it would be interesting to ask the speakers, and especially two very important writers, Aharon Appelfeld, that was escaped, lived in the woods for 2 years during the Holocaust and was speaking German, and switched to writing Hebrew. He actually explained, as well as Sami Michael from Iraqi origin, and that wrote in Arabic, as Bob mentioned, both said to me, I interviewed them, that actually it was not a very easy switch. It's not a switch actually from one language to another. They needed to pass from Hebrew, from their mother tongues to Hebrew through a transitional language. Each one explained, like Aharon Appelfeld said, he could not speak or write in German anymore because of the language, but it was his mother tongue. But Yiddish, learning Yiddish and in the Hebrew University, that has both components, Hebrew and German, allowed him to write in Hebrew. Aharon Appelfeld stressed the fact that language is not only about syntaxis, morphology, it's also about emotion and connection to the language. And there was something, you could say maybe traumatic in German, and he wanted to abandon that language. And he discovers Hebrew, but he needs, like also Sami Michael, to go through a mimetic time. He needs to copy Hebrew. And Sami Michael needed to translate, actually, Arabic to Hebrew in order to sort of integrate Hebrew. But it was not something that that can be only explained with the tools of linguistics. And therefore, I thought it would be interesting to think about this process also using psychoanalytical tools. Yes, you wanted to add something? No. So this book goes through from the more modern period to the past. And the hypothesis is that this reconstruction of Hebrew is done through what I call an intertextual anastylosis. An anastylosis comes from archaeology, and it is the reconstruction of an edifice with the elements you find inside. And Hebrew was reconstructed with the layers of the language, and that's what Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, the founder, or one of the founders of modern Hebrew, shows us. Then the second layer allows us to acknowledge what are the materials, how do we actually invent this language? How do you do that? Because the language was not spoken on a daily basis for 2,000 years. It was used as a lingua franca, as a language between scholars. It continued to evolve, and we spoke about it today with Dan. It continued to evolve in writing, because there is all the corpus after the Bible, there is the Talmudic corpus, there is the medieval corpus, before that the Chazal corpus. So it continued to evolve, and the particularity of Hebrew is that it also continued to be disseminated in the languages that Jewish people spoke, whether it would be Yiddish, so it would mix German and Hebrew, French, with dialects, Judeo-Arabic. So Hebrew continued to be, to exist in a written way, and it could be spoken between scholars, but it was not a daily language a mother would talk with her children. So this is a sui generis experiment even in the history of languages, where a language that was mostly written comes to life and is being used by a new nation later, because Eliezer Ben-Yehuda died in 1922, much before the creation of the State of Israel. He decides that Hebrew should be the language that the Jewish people should speak back then in Eretz Israel or Palestine. And he worked relentlessly. He went all around the world looking for strata, for corpuses of literature, of Hebrew literature. He traveled to Egypt. He went to Oxford to see the Geniza. He went to Paris. He went everywhere to work on his monumental oeuvre, which is his dictionary that is embracing all the strata of Hebrew from the Bible till his days. And he only got to see actually the four first volumes because he died before, and some of the presidents of the Hebrew Academy continued his work. So he did a tremendous and most influential and important work, lexicographical work. He was not a lexicographer. Actually, he studied medicine in Paris, got sick, went to Algeria, heard the first voices of Sephardic Jews pronouncing Hebrew, and decided, I have to reinvent Hebrew. It was kind of a project. It is important also maybe to mention that in the 19th century, there were some reforms in languages. He was not the only one working on language, but this is very unique. He worked in a very unique way, and that is what I tried to show through his archive. And this image that you see is a tractate, Chulin tractate, and you can see he actually here captured his own name, Eliezer Ben-Yehuda. And he used a very unique method because, you know, Hebrew exists from the Bible. How do you actually organize this dictionary? So he used a method. He used colors. And you'll see here some colors. So here is the blue and the red. So each color, and that is the research I conducted on it, represents another strata of Hebrew. Red is the Bible. Blue is the Middle Ages. So he sort of tried to look into the archaeology of Hebrew lexicography. And as Bob mentioned, his idea of reviving Hebrew, if we can use this word of revival, he was working both on the lexicography, but it's not enough just to create a language. People need to adopt it. We know that, for example, Esperanto was invented as well, and it has this beautiful ideal of it being a language with no difficulties grammatically speaking, easy for pronunciation, and yet it is not a language. At the same time, it was invented. It is not a language that is spoken by by mother. It is not transmitted to children. It continues to be alive, but it's not a mother tongue. So he decided to take his son as an experiment. He isolated him from all languages and decided in 1882 that the only language that Itamar Ben-Avi would hear would be Hebrew. He also understood the media, and in order to transmit also the foundations of this new language, he worked also, he used the Hebrew press. He decided that there should be newspapers using Hebrew. He had a couple of newspapers, and he also thought about education. It's so important to educate the young children and transmit to them the language. So his action is very important on a variety of fields, but this, what surprised me, as Bob mentioned, was that this is actually new material to see how Eliezer Ben-Yehuda worked. I was just going to the Academy of Hebrew Language, and I was just opening his books, and I thought maybe there was a child, with the pencils. And then I understood little by little. It took some time to understand how the method works. So the colors reflect there are 4 colors. There is red, blue, black, and also purple, and what I understand from purple is that it's from it's words that he invented or neologisms. For example, maybe I don't have the word in English, but zimzum, for example. How do you say buzz? Lezamzem. Buzz. Zimzum. Yeah. To buzz. So he invented, for example, this word, but he also invented words that did not actually get to the Hebrew speakers. They did not accept it as democracy, kehiliya. Today we don't use this word in Hebrew. And then it seemed important, after understanding what is the material of the language? How does he invent the words? He invented also the word dictionary, actually does not exist in Hebrew, milon. To see through his archive how he works, to get into his laboratory and to see how he thinks and how he works. But actually, in his introduction, in his dictionary, he is talking about Spinoza. His first reference, or one of the first references, is Spinoza. And I was thinking why Spinoza is so important here. So Spinoza is important, and I want to show you maybe, yeah, that is another. This is the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, and you can find, this is a manuscript. This is Spinoza's handwriting, actually, a very rare manuscript that you can find in Haifa University. And you can see that there is Hebrew there in Spinoza's manuscript. And actually, the translations in French, I don't know about the translation in English that much, but they erased, when I was writing the book, there was no Hebrew in this fundamental text that Spinoza wrote in 1670 anonymously and with a false name of publisher, because he said some things that would shake Europe. For example, and you will not be maybe upset by what I say, but he said Moses did not write the Torah. So today it's not something that can be shocking, but that back then, and he was an heretic. He was excommunicated at the age of 23, a young man that had not published anything before. And this text is fundamental because he says, as Bob said, that Hebrew is a text as any other text. And it is an edited text, it has spelling mistakes, and that was not very popular to say that back then. But what I found out is that he also wrote a Hebrew grammar, and it was published posthumously at 1677 with the ethics. So I thought it would be interesting to see what is there in that grammar. And in that grammar, Spinoza sort of considers Hebrew as a text, which means that it's not sacred anymore, or it is sacred, but it could be also understood using with the tools of reason. And he, in that grammar, for example, he allows himself to mix Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, with other layers of Hebrew, and that was very unique and also very unusual at his time. So Spinoza's importance is to understand that he allows to understand that Hebrew is not or can be considered either than a sacred language. So the book goes from present to the past to understand the different layers, changing the scope from literature to archive and linguistics, and then getting to philosophy and language.
Okay, I'm going to just make a couple of brief comments before we turn to your questions. One is what is compelling about your analysis is that the normalization of the Hebrew language went hand in hand with the normalization of Jewish existence. That is, the Jews were no longer Am levadad yishkon, a people that dwells alone, but they were like other peoples. And they weren't defined by religion, by some kind of direct line to God, but rather like all other peoples by a culture. So this is really quite radical. So treatment of language does lead to more fundamental things. One quick word about Eliezer Ben-Yehuda's innovations. Not only were some of them not accepted, but some of them got scrambled. Maybe the most famous example is you needed Hebrew words for chorus or choir and orchestra. So very sensibly, he said the word for chorus would be tizmoret, because the root of that word comes from singing, lizamer, and the word for orchestra would be makela, because the Greek word orchestra means a group of people gathered together, which is what makela. So I don't know how it came about, but it was switched, and everybody says today, I'm going to the performance of the Makila, the Tizmot Yisraelit, and they're not talking about a chorus, they're talking about an orchestra. Now, one other thing, as you spoke, that occurred to me, the Hebrew novelist Amos Oz, whose first language is definitely Hebrew, and he had this amazing facility in writing Hebrew, which is almost a dangerous facility from at times. You probably will agree. In one of his late but he also had a passionate commitment to the Hebrew language. He said, I'm against all fanaticisms, but the one thing I'm fanatic about is Hebrew. And in one of his late lectures about Hebrew, he said that Hebrew was never a dead language. And then in a beautiful analogy, he said, it was a sleeping beauty. And then people like Spinoza and Eliezer Ben-Yehuda and Sami and Aharon Appelfeld gave the kiss to this sleeping beauty and revivified her. Okay, why don't we go to questions?
Oh, yeah.
I'm curious, especially knowing your background in psychoanalysis, about the phrase mother tongue, especially with like discourses about Yiddish as more feminized and of the house, and Hebrew as like the masculinized new Jew language. What does mother tongue take on in your research, and what is like is there something about the femininity of it?
Thank you for your question. So actually, I was curious about this term mother tongue, because in many languages, actually, we use the same term, mother tongue, sfat em, lingua materna. We really use this expression to talk about the first language acquired by a child. It's true, when talking about Yiddish was more considered as the feminine language, whereas Hebrew the more paternal language. And correct me if I'm wrong. Women did not speak much Hebrew, as far as I know. It was mostly spoken by men. So there is also this dimension in Hebrew. However, I think the Yiddish maybe somewhere else in the language, meaning because a lot of the revivalists spoke Yiddish, there is something about the structure of the language that could remind, and I'm speaking also, Isaac, maybe you could also comment on that. But Yiddish did not disappear. I call also what happened a sort of an inverse Babel, because it's all the languages that Jewish communities spoke, that gather into this Hebrew, that of course has a strong Semitic component, and yet it also absorbs all the other influences, like with the accent, and intonation, I mean, with the syntax. But my understanding of a mother tongue is this, it's also the language of emotions. It's not only about rational. And that is why, for example, Hebrew works, whereas Esperanto does not work. Because there is connection, an important connection between, you were talking about Jewish existence, between the Jewish people to that language. It was the language of their ancestors. So, so this connection allow us to understand through this unique case in the history of linguistics, what is a mother tongue.
I can't resist on the question of the differentiation of speakers between Yiddish and Hebrew. I can't resist sharing an anecdote, which I think you will appreciate. The great Yiddishist and comparative literature scholar Benjamin Harshav was a dear friend of mine. And when he was at the end of a visiting year he spent at Berkeley, he moved out of his rental house and stayed with my wife and me for 2 weeks before he went back to Israel. And then my wife had become friendly with Malka Chefetz Tussman, who was an eminent Yiddish poet who lived in Berkeley because her son was on the Berkeley faculty. You probably know. Yeah. And so my wife, meaning the best, said, let's invite Malka for dinner with Benjamin, and I'm sure they'll hit it off. Well, now, Benjamin was a great scholar. He was sometimes a little short on tact. And a few minutes into the dinner conversation, he said, there's a big difference between the Yiddish that women write and the Yiddish that men write. The men had this background in the yeshiva, and their Yiddish is full of Hebraisms and allusions to classical Hebrew texts, whereas the Yiddish of women is much more colloquial. Well, Malka Chefetz wasn't hit the ceiling. Her father, who was a Hebraist, had taught her Hebrew, and she grew up reading Bialik and Januchowski. So they got in a big fight, and the evening was a disaster, although there was a sweet postscript to this.
Was the food good?
My wife was a wonderful cook. A week or so later, Malka called my wife, Carol, and she said, in the library, I found a book of Yiddish poems that Benjamin Harshav had published when he was in his early 20s. And the man is a real poet. I forgive him everything.
In your research, since you're relating to the psychoanalytic or emotional base of a language, do you relate to the specificities of what people brought from their mother tongue into Hebrew? Growing up with parents who came from Europe and later learning German and Polish, mostly German, it became so clear to me that a lot of the Hebrew that I heard growing up had full sentences that were translated completely from the languages they brought. Speaking of emotional attachment to the language.
Yes, so thank you for your question. So I think that although the aim of Eliezer Ben-Yehuda was to revive Hebrew from the Bible to his time. You could not prevent your own experience in a way. He lived with other languages. He grew up with other languages. And actually what is quite, to me, was quite astonishing is to see that he worked, because he's like a Hebrew fanatic, only Hebrew. But when you see how he worked with Arabic. There is a dictionary where you see really he's working with Arabic, Hebrew, and French, and Latin, German, and Greek. So he's all the time actually, while working on Hebrew and telling everybody this is pure Hebrew, he's all the time inspired. And his laboratory shows that. He needs also the tractate I showed, you see it's bilingual. There is not only Hebrew. So he constantly works with other languages. So I think that the idea of the purity of Hebrew is conceptual, but if you're born with another language and this is your native language, and also the poets and the writers said that, that you never forget this language. It always stays. You cannot erase this mother tongue. So it is not a new mother tongue. And they talk also about it as Hebrew as an artificial language for them. And for Appelfeld, a language that allows him to have distance from German. So I think that there is always the influence of the first language that interferes whether you want it or you don't want it. This is, so regarding what you said, it's of course, they also translate expressions. Of course, there is Yiddish, there are other influences in Hebrew. It's not it's not a language going in a linear way from the Bible to today.
I'm a little bit worried that I'm asking a question you already answered. But I'm interested in what endows a language with its character. I mean, it's just a collection of words. Are the words, you said that Hebrew has an emotional content. Is it because the words are emotional? Is it because the structure of the language evokes emotion? What is it that gives Hebrew its unique character?
So it's a very good question. I would say that language, we talked about emotion, but there is another psychological, psychoanalytical term that is important, is that, and it is identity. I think Hebrew, for the people who decided to adopt this language, also allowed them to find a new identity. And people that came to Palestine or to Eretz Israel, they were looking for a new identity. A lot of them, not all, because some were already there, but a lot needed to disconnect actually from Europe, from their European roots. And they wanted to adopt a new language. They changed their names to Hebrew names, and even the family names to Hebrew names. So I think the connection is not only about the text and the importance of the text, although it is central, of course. It is also a question of identity. Sure.
Since you mentioned identity, I will say something autobiographical. I became a speaker of Hebrew, I think at the age of 16. And Hebrew then, I see, looking back over these many decades, I see that the Hebrew language became a bedrock of my Jewish identity. But it wasn't quite rebelling against the previous kind of Jewish identity, but sort of balancing together in improbable ways my American identity, which was in English, and my Jewish identity, which was in Hebrew.
Thank you.
My question, and I think you touched on it a little in your previous answer, is if you could talk a little about the mechanics of how Hebrew became again a living language. In other words, it's one thing for Eliezer Ben-Yehuda to lay out this dictionary, but it's quite another for the actual people to begin speaking in that language, to absorb it, and indeed to pass it on from mother to child. Could you speak a little about how it was in practice disseminated in the land of Israel or in Palestine?
So, there is the Enlightenment period, the Haskalah, back in the 18th century. So after Spinoza, or I think Spinoza's thought was really essential, but yet the Haskalah, I think it's another movement. So there is history also, historical processes, the Haskalah, the pogroms also, the fact that Jewish people were conducted, they fled from where they were from. So the mechanism is also linked to history, of course. There was an existential need to leave the shtetls, the lands, the countries, and to come to Israel, or before Israel even was created. This process was enhanced also after the Second World War, during the wars in general. And actually, in 1913, there was this question, it's called the War of Languages. It was not that obvious that Hebrew should be the language that would be spoken by the Jewish people in Palestine or in the land of Israel. So it was not, I'm sort of maybe describing it as something easygoing, but it was a long process resulting from also history and historical processes, and with a lot of fights. And actually, Ben-Yehuda was even jailed, so he was not very popular when during his life. He was famous. He was a little eccentric also, but it's not like everybody followed his idea. That was a little unusual, not to say crazy, to decide to revive Hebrew. So I think there is it's an historical processes. Migration processes. Also, it is the time when nations start to define themselves in Europe in the 19th century. It's influenced also by that. So the mechanisms are multiple, I would say. There is not one mechanism that allows us to understand that. And all the people gathered there, and Hebrew was also chosen because it was a new language in a way. It was not the language of a particular community. It was a language that everybody needed to learn. Not maybe everybody. There was a small amount of people that were in the Yishuv, but generally it was a new language. So this language also allowed to unify the community. Maybe you want to add something? No.
I'm feeling a little guilty. The reason is that Bob and I have been colleagues for half a century, and I could have asked him this a long time ago, and I didn't, but I've got both of you now, okay? And the question is rather more pedestrian than some of the questions have been asked, and that is, how did we get a hoch ivrit? When I was young, my Hebrew pronunciation was all influenced by the fact that I came from a Yiddish-speaking family. And then one day, there were people speaking Yiddish with a different accent.
Hebrew.
Pardon?
Speaking Hebrew with it.
Speaking Hebrew with a different accent altogether. So I tried to adjust, imperfectly, of course, but I did try. All languages have dialects and variations on the theme. Yiddish had many, of course, and even some clandestine Yiddish forms that I've learned about. So how did we get not just the location, how did we get the more Sephardic pronunciation of Hebrew? How is a language to be pronounced? Okay? You want to tackle that one?
Actually,
think of English, for example. Innumerable ways in which there is no King's English or Queen's English. Really, there isn't. So how do we get there?
so actually, in Jewish tradition, you can read the language, the Hebrew, and chant it according to the tradition. I mean, if you're a Sephardi, you will chant it differently than if you come from a Ashkenazi origin. Again, Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, he's there. He went to Algeria, and so there are different pronunciation of Hebrew. There is an Ashkenazi pronunciation and a more Sephardi pronunciation. But he thought that Hebrew should resemble as much as it can to Arabic, because of the Semitic origin. So the Hebrew that is spoken, at least nowadays in Israel, because there are two options in Hebrew. There is the Mil'el and the Milra. It depends if you want to put the stress on the first syllable or on the second and last syllable. So he decided it should follow the Sephardi tradition in order to be as close as possible to Arabic. That is a Semitic language. That was his idea, because there were poets like Bialik, and all their poetry should be read, or is to be read with Ashkenazi pronunciation.
There's a sense of authenticity there.
Yeah.
I'll add a couple of things. I'm sure that Ben-Yehuda was also guided by the cantillation markings in the traditional, in the biblical text, which indicate the stressed syllable. And the stressed syllable was pretty consistent, except for certain patterns of words, was the ultimate, not the penultimate. Now, I'd like to bring my late friend Benjamin Harchav back into this. He wrote, I think, a very fine book called Language in Time of Revolution, which is sort of, you might look at it as a companion piece to Keren Mock's book. It looks at the revival of Hebrew from a different angle. Doesn't contradict anything that she wrote. In regard to the Sephardic accent, the so-called Sephardic accent, he shows the following, that they needed to have an accent which was not redolent of the Beit Midrash and the yeshiva and the world of Jewish orthodoxy against which they were rebelling. So they wanted a new, purportedly authentic pronunciation. But what he shows is that it never was really authentic. That is, there were phonemes that as native speakers of Yiddish, they couldn't reproduce. So what's called the Sephardic accent is kind of a compromise, or you might say even a hodgepodge.
Yeah, like the chet. The chet. We don't pronounce the chet the same, yeah.
And the vowels are not quite the
Yeah,
same.
the vowels as well.
Yes, I have a question on asking for comments. There are two parts into it. First is there were Jews in Israel in certain areas, in Pekin, for example, through the years. And I assume that they were speaking Hebrew. So the first question is how their language fits into the modern language. And the other part is, if you can comment, maybe it might be out of your scope of this book, how come the Jews bounce out of the Hebrew when they move out of Israel?
What do you mean by bounce out?
They stop using Hebrew for the daily usage. They used it only for the prayers.
So, yes, there was a community existing in this territory of people that spoke, could speak Hebrew. So, there were Jewish people that were there for generations. That if that's what you mean. So they also participated in a way in this revival, but I don't know actually exactly what would be their part in reshaping and reviving the language. Do you know about this specific community? The community that was in Israel, in the land of Eretz Israel back then, how they impacted like the revival itself? I think it's a very small part of the population. It did not represent much, and the research is more focused on the revivalists, on the people that invented words, that also literature had a big importance, also writing in Hebrew. So this population, it's not, I don't know much about how they impacted the broader project of reviving Hebrew. And regarding your second question, so now I think we can say that Ben-Yehuda and other revivalists, they accomplished their mission. Hebrew is spoken nowadays as any other language. So people are free to go to another country and decide to change Hebrew for another language. But what was particular when Hebrew was created is that people abandoned their mother tongues to adopt a language that did not already exist as a very formed and structured language. That is the big difference with other languages. It's not like changing from Italian to German or from English to Chinese. Hebrew was not this kind of very structured language. There were options like even identity, the word identity. Ben-Yehuda invented the word mihut, which is today's zehut. So there were some words that are not even used today. It was a process. So people are also, you were mentioning the prayer, and it's important to say that some people, even today, refuse to speak Hebrew because they consider it sacred, and they would rather speak Yiddish instead of Hebrew. So the sacred status of Hebrew did not totally disappear.
Just another little personal anecdote about Hebrew becoming a normal language. In the early 80s, I spent a year in Jerusalem at the Institute for Advanced Studies. And they gave me an apartment on French Hill. So it was density of living which we had not been accustomed to. And the two sons I had with my wife, Carol, not down to my first marriage, were then 8 and 1.5. So I was at the local playground with the little guy, and that was the period when Israel accepted a certain number of boat people from Vietnam, who were fleeing Vietnam. And there were a couple of girls, about 7 or 8, who were obviously Vietnamese. And as I stood there watching them, they started talking with each other, and they were talking Hebrew. And I said to myself, oh my God, Israel isn't some kind of Meshuggah thing for people like me. It's a normal language.
Yeah, exactly.
Since I'm holding the microphone, I'll take a liberty to ask. I actually have 2 questions. The first is picking up on this theme of the mother tongue mentioned earlier, which is what do we know about Ben-Yehuda's wife's Hebrew, the mother of the first Hebrew-speaking child? What was her Hebrew like? How did she acquire it? What was the experience of helping her family revitalize the language like for her, if we know anything?
About his wife, you mean?
Yeah, the mother of Itamar's
Deborah,
mother. My second question is more speculative, which is what do you think Ben-Yehuda would think of the fact that Hebrew, obviously, because it's a living language, it continues to change, and even the way that his name is pronounced by Israelis, where it's Yehuda, not Yehuda, and it's even the H is missing. What would he have thought about the changes that are taking place on a daily basis in modern Hebrew?
I'll start with the second one. I think he would be very happy to see that Hebrew is a living language, that it certainly is very much influenced by other languages still, and English actually is a very important language because Israelis have to know English. I mean, they know another language because speaking Hebrew in the world, it's a little complicated in a globalized world to speak only Hebrew. So I think seeing this language continuing its spoken path would bring him pride, and he may not like certain words, certain expressions, but I think he would be proud that this project that he led, not only by himself, but he had a very important part in it, succeeded. It's working. The language is very much alive. And regarding Deborah, so actually, there is a famous sort of scene about Ben-Yehuda forcing his son Itamar to hear only Hebrew, sort of isolating him from the population in Jerusalem back then in 1882. And he forced also his wife to speak only Hebrew to him, and the nanny had to speak only Hebrew to him. There was a lot of Hebrew pressure on this young first speaker of Hebrew. And at some point, apparently, she started to sing a lullaby in Russian, because the boy was mute, I think, until the age of 3 or 4. He would not speak, but with such pressure, this is too much Jewish pressure on a young boy, so he would not speak. And then she sang in Russian. I mean, this is sort of a myth. I talk about it also in the book because there are 2 versions to this myth. And then Ben-Yehuda is not happy. He's seeing what is going on, and he starts to sort of, I don't know if scream, but he's very much annoyed by hearing that. And then Itamar actually expresses his first words, "Dad, no." So we do not know much. I do not know much about Deborah's role, but she also died very young, and he married the sister of Deborah, Chemda, and Chemda was really his behind him on all his projects. She followed him. She helped him also look for the words, writing them down. She had a very important impact on his work, and and both of them came from a Haskalah family. So I suppose that back then it was very difficult to speak Hebrew to start with, and all this pressure was not making things easier. But these actually, it's important, Isaac, that you mentioned these figures, because they're actually very much in the background nowadays. But I think they had a very important role actually for Ben-Yehuda. Both.
Time for maybe 2 more questions. So these 2.
Make it 3.
So first of all, there is such a thing as the King's English, and it's what I speak. So just make that clear. Are you familiar with Gilad Zuckerman's book, Israeli Safa Yafa?
Yeah.
I fell on that by chance because I randomly met his wife in Australia in 2009. But I mean, his contention is that the people who revived Hebrew were all native speakers of basically Indo-European languages, right? And that he said, yes, Eliezer Ben-Yehuda concentrated on coming up with words. I mean, even the famous song says that, right? But they didn't really think about syntax. And if you look at the syntax of Israeli, it's completely Indo-European. I mean, they've even turned it into a Haberi language, right? Yeshli et hasefer, right? Because it's very hard to get by without that. So I'm just wondering if you have a comment on his general thesis that modern Hebrew, or Israeli as he likes to refer to it, is really more of a European language it has more of a connection to European languages than it does to biblical Hebrew, maybe, Midrashic Hebrew, medieval Hebrew. Also, I listen to, we watch a fair amount of Israeli television, because now you can. I mean, people like, Kobi Meidan and Ronnie Kuban, these people can't get through 2 sentences without English. I mean, how do they manage, right?
So I think Gilad Zuckerman's theory is interesting. He calls actually Hebrew not Hebrew, then he calls it Israeli. It's not Hebrew anymore. It's another sort of branch of Hebrew. He considers it as another branch. I think it's interesting to have to look at Hebrew through different perspectives. And it is an important point, saying that the syntax is, and he has done a lot of research on that, is close or is identical to Indo-European languages. However, I think that the natives are also allowed to decide how they would want to call their language. So there is something about imposing sort of another name for the language that is can be considered as artificial. So I think it's important to conduct the discussion between scholars and to see, and it's also a question of perspective on language. And it is your question, what identifies a language as it is, as a Semitic language, as an Indo-European language? Would it be the morphology? Would it be the syntax? Or other? So in Israel, people definitely consider Hebrew as purely Semitic, saying that, or maybe not purely, but very Semitic language. And Gilad Zuckerman's theory also says that there is no continuation of native speakers of the language because it was not transmitted the same way as a language learned. So I think there are interesting and important points in his claim. But if people want to call Hebrew Hebrew, I think they should be free to.
Yeah. My friend Benjamin Arshav also claimed that, you read an Israeli newspaper and the syntax is not Hebrew. It really reads almost as though it were a translation from English. There's a lot of truth to that but it's not entirely true. To begin with, even in newspaper prose, which is different from literary prose, of course, you have all kind, maybe especially not so much on the level of syntax, but on the level of idiom. You have all kinds of traditional idioms which are second nature in modern Israeli Hebrew, like the word for fame is monitin, which comes from Rabbinic Hebrew. The way you say someone was bankrupt is pashatat regel, which is also Rabbinic Hebrew. And then, of course, when you get into literary prose, say the prose of David Grossman, one of my favorite novelists, it is very rich, and it can't resist exploiting many of the traditional expressive resources of Hebrew.
Well, speaking of literature, I wonder with Appelfeld, if he was trying to reject German, and so he wrote in Hebrew, how did he do that exactly? Was he translating everything into from German in his head to Hebrew, or did he teach himself to actually think in Hebrew, which doesn't seem like that could happen overnight?
So actually, I'm very privileged to have met and interviewed these two important and so interesting novelists. And Appelfeld, he was a quiet man. He spent 2 years in a forest, if I'm not mistaken, in Ukraine. And when he arrived, it was, I think, around 13 years old. He had difficulty talking at all because he was not speaking, because speaking would also could be dangerous, speaking your language. So he was a very silent man. He spoke in a very slow rhythm, like waiting every word. That's what I sensed. So he's describing actually the process in which he needed, I mean, at some point he wanted to speak, and he associated, I think it's in one of his novels, the murder of the language with the murder of his mother. It's combined. He could not talk anymore the language. The language became like traumatic in a way. He could not hear the sounds of that language. So he describes a slow process from coming from a house that is not religious, hearing Yiddish in his childhood with his grandparents, escaping in the woods, being very silent, studying Hebrew, and he really needed to incorporate the words. He would write and passages of the Bible. He was very much connected to the Bible. And he went to study Yiddish in the Hebrew University. And then it was like the language, it was German with Hebrew. He wrote some poems back then in Hebrew. And then he made the switch to Hebrew. He abandoned Yiddish, but he needed the connection with Hebrew through Yiddish. It's not German directly to Hebrew. He needed this transitional language, Yiddish, that shares both components in order to abandon mimetism. And he said something very interesting, I think. He said, I need to be constant with that language. He cannot, it's something that is also related to the body. That's how he described it. It needs to be constant. He cannot try even. I was asking them, do you translate? No, they do not translate. They really need to be, and for example, Appelfeld, he would read books only in Hebrew. he needed to be constant with the language.
I'd like to ask you a question.
Okay. Uh-oh.
No, it's not a hard question.
I know.
I think that the greatest Hebrew poet, of course, you deal with prose for good reason. The greatest Hebrew poet of the second half of the 20th century, and I think one of the great poets in any language in that era, was Yehuda Amichai, whom, okay, I'll put my cards on the table. Yehuda was also a dear friend. And he came to Israel, well, Palestine, with his parents at the age of 12. So his first language was German. Evidently, he got a good deal of Hebrew in Germany because he was sent to a Jewish school. But still, his Muttersprache was German. Now, a rather questionable biography in English of Amichai came out a few years ago, in which the biographer, because she had discovered German versions of very few poems in the Amichai archive at Yale, concluded that his general practice was to compose poems in German and then translate them into Hebrew. I don't think that stands up for a minute, especially because he's constantly playing with the intrinsic qualities of the Hebrew language and exploiting them in brilliantly expressive ways. So in regard to the first third of your book, what's your take on Amichai?
So actually, I speak about, in the book, I talk about another poet, Avot Yeshurun.
Yes.
So what I think is very maybe unique about contemporary Hebrew poetry, and that's what actually Sami Michael says, they had some flexibility in a way in the language. They allowed themselves to, because the limits of the language were being defined in their time, they allowed themselves to be free. That's how he says. He says that his Hebrew, Sami Michael, is inspired by the structures and his notions of Arabic. And regarding translation, he also, Sami Michael, that comes from Arabic, says that he started to write in Hebrew actually he published his first book, I think it was around his 50s. He needed to translate the trilogy of Mahfuz, of Negib Mahfuz. So it's 3 imposing volumes. And after translating, he stopped working with Arabic. So I think that the relation with the translation is quite complex. And maybe it is a need before sort of emerging, before of the need of the poet and of the writer to emerge himself in Hebrew. Maybe there is a time when translation is there, but after that it's only a transitional phase, and then that's what they described. They described mimetism, translation, and then they would not touch these languages. They would not think in these languages, and they needed the consistency of Hebrew, because it's a craft. A language for the writer is a craft, and you need to be constantly working with this craft, not with another craft. They really, that's how I understood it.
Yeah, just one further thought about translation. An important direction in the literary revival of Hebrew in Europe in the 19th century was translation. That is, they translated Cervantes, they translated Gogol, and so forth. And that's partly how they revived the language.
Yes, they translated, and they also, Ben-Yehuda, it was important for him that everyday news, that Hebrew would not be only about actually literature and intellectual, and they would need like words also for everyday use. And about translation, what we see behind us is Spinoza's work, it's his own manuscript. And Spinoza considered there is in each translation, and you know that better than everyone here, translation of the Bible, you have an angle. You have a way, I will not talk about theory of translation because it's very complex and could be long. But Spinoza himself decided to translate the Hebrew to Latin, although there were existing translations. So translation is a way to convey new ideas, to convey new dimensions, but also I think in a way, to reinterpret the original text. And the Hebrew writers needed all this and it's very an important point. They needed all this new literature to revive Hebrew.
Okay, thank you. That's all from our speakers.